Alrighty, welcome to Roundtable Decision. I am your host, Wyatt Birkenoff. And as you might know from either the title or if you've been following this series, I am making a medieval book, and this is my third live stream or third episode of this book series. And if you watch the other two, you'll kind of learn about my ideas about the book as a whole and everything around there. And you notice that I say as a whole a lot. Anyway, that's a side note. I don't really know why, but anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent on that. But in my first live stream, I read the 10 pages I wrote originally for a school project. And I wrote down my ideas and did my planning and all that around that school project. And anyway, I read all those 10 pages and kind of discussed my plans for the novel. My second live stream, I discussed two ideas from continuing chapter 1, or basically making a whole new chapter 1 and using what I wrote as a prologue. And that was my first idea. And to John's credit, who is a fellow YouTuber on Freedom Scoop, and I'll plug Freedom Scoop in a bit before we really dive in. But he had the idea of using what I wrote as the prologue and keeping it intact and original, as it was a really good 10 or so pages of writing. And making a chapter 1 from that perspective of how the prologue ended, which you would have to check my first live stream to hear about. And I also made a short video of my two ideas I discussed a little bit more in detail in my second live stream, or my second video, but you can find just that part with my two ideas. So if you're curious about what my two ideas are for chapter 1, or for chapter 1, you can go ahead and check that video out either after this one is done or stop now to look at it, as it might give you more context on where I'm starting this video. But before I really dive into the video series, into what we are getting into in today's live stream, I thought I would plug a few things before I dive deep. So the first thing is basically I plan to do a lot more videos coming out soon, and like I said in my last video yesterday about the COVID-19 protest, I don't want them all to be COVID related, even though that is what's the majority of the news cycle, and I don't really necessarily want it to be the majority of my videos, as everybody's kind of already tired of hearing about it. So because of that, I'm going to have a few different type of videos coming out. And a lot of those videos are going to be psychology related, because I am doing a psychology college class. And I've been very busy lately as everything's moved online for college. And it's made things a little harder and a little trickier. And that's why I haven't been able to do as much videos recently. But I plan on changing that soon. And I don't plan on using that as an excuse really. But it's just more about getting organized and getting what I want to do done. But I plan on also using another one of my classes as kind of a video, because I do think it's an interesting topic and will give you insight into who I am and what I believe as a person coming soon. But I don't really want to spoil that video topic as of yet. And it's probably going to be later this week, if not early next week, when that video comes out. But I also highly encourage you to check out freedomscoop.com, which is I'm a part of, and which a lot of other people are part of, like the Generational Gap and Eds from Edward and Stephen and Garamus, and a couple others who have joined, like R-Rated Conservative and I believe Freckled Libertarian, are one of the other libertarians who are very popular on Twitter. Anyway. So that's kind of the big major news, what's going on with me and things you should check out, especially if you kind of liked my content. There's very similar ideas, like the Generational Gap talks about generational differences, obviously, with their political viewpoints with John and Robert, and I would highly encourage checking them out. But you also have Stephen and Garamus, who is a news commentary person, and really dives in deep into topics and has multiple hour-long streams. So if you're into that and you're into daily content, I would highly encourage checking Stephen and Garamus out. And I'll leave that link in the video afterwards. But before I just keep blabbering on about other things, let's actually get into what today's video is about, and that is my book and what I plan to do with chapter 1. So I have here my character page from Campfire, and in this character page, it talks about, kind of gives you notes that you can use for each character and for what the characters are about and who they are and what they look like and their backstory and all that. And I'm not really going to dive too much into what each character is, as I've already done that before, but I just felt like I would show this as kind of a brief starting point for what I'm getting into in today's video. But let's dive into what my actual video is going to be about today. Oops. As you can see, the insight into the background. Anyway, I don't know why I said okay. So, as I discussed in my previous video, I was wanting to learn a lot about medieval culture. I did study medieval times and history, and the Roman times were something that I was very interested in. Therefore, I thought I would kind of set my book into early medieval times with the fall of the Roman Empire. And I knew I needed to research a lot more about how people actually lived in medieval times, and more importantly, how the poor lived in medieval times. And I learned about different factions that the poor people are called, such as peasants and serfs, with serfs being under peasants. And in my last stream, I read a few articles about what life was like as a peasant or life was like as a serf. And John from Generational Gap mentioned that a lot of the articles seemed very one-sided, one could say, and with the very harshest of conditions, when in reality it wasn't necessarily that. And in history, that is a lot of times true. But not only did I want to look at the past and what medieval people lived like, I also wanted to discover what castles were like, and not so much the fantasy, large type of castles you see at like Disney or any other things like that. I wanted them to be more ground on what castles would have looked like in the medieval era directly. So I was kind of researching that as well. So those were the two main things I researched last. And I continued that research throughout the week. And I'll kind of briefly talk about what some of the research looked like from what I discovered throughout the week. Because I made a checklist, and I did a large part of the checklist, even though I wanted to do a little bit more, but life got in the way. So, as you can see here, this was a layout of one of the castles that I found very interesting, with the Dover Castle. And the Dover Castle was in a very strategic location, as it was on top of a hill and guarded an area of water that they could use for navy. And by controlling their site and controlling their docks from that water viewpoint, they were able to secure their location better. It was a very, very, very strategic location in order to get their will done and to get their mighty empire to continue, so to speak. But as you can see from this picture, what I copied and pasted into my Word document of ongoing research, this was kind of a interior plan of what the castle might have looked like. So you had the Norfolk Towers on outside of the wall. Well, not really outside of the wall, but more along the wall. Then when you move in, you had the keep, and that was the large part of what you think of a castle, with being the throne room and where the people stay and where royalty stayed and all that. So the keep is a very vital role in a castle, and as I've already kind of said, in fantasy, especially TV shows or movies, they tend to only really show the keep and not so much what's around it. But when you go into the interior of the castle, you see that there was the lighthouse and the Colton's Gateway, the inner belly walls, the bigger walls, the constable gateway, the cannon gateway, the officers' barracks, where they kept the horses, where they kept their multiple other towers like archery towers and St. John's Tower. So castles, and what I learned and kind of already knew, is that castles have multiple layers to them. They don't just have one tower with being the lookout tower, or one tower being where they would have the archers. They had multiple towers together. And not when I mean together, I don't mean next to each other. I mean within the castle walls. And these towers played vital roles into keeping the defense of the tower set. Because as one of the articles talked about, when we tend to think of castles, we tend to think of them with having a moat and being gigantic and huge, with towers that were massive and you could unlook and see until the edge of the earth, so to speak. And you had archers and you had just epicness around the whole thing, and the keep and the throne room was huge and highly decorated. But that's not really the case for a lot of castles. A lot of castles weren't that exciting and weren't that huge, because the average castle tended to just keep their soldiers secure and keep their soldiers fed. And although that's a very important thing, it wasn't necessarily the biggest thing. Like in Game of Thrones, when the last battle at King's Landing, you had the famous episode, which I think was third to last or second to last, of the bell towers. And when Daenerys Targaryen said, when you hear the bells, Peter Dinklage said, when you hear, or not Peter Dinklage, damn it, what's his name? The imp. I cannot think. The imp, when he was like, when you hear the bells ring, don't burn the city or don't kill everybody. And then when she heard the bells ring, she ended up killing everybody. So obviously, a lot of people know about bell towers within castles. But as I was kind of saying, a lot of people think of castles as being these huge, magnificent things, when in reality, they weren't necessarily that case, and most castles were not that case. I don't want my book necessarily to be having all boring castles, because I do think castles are one of the big things that are going to draw people into wanting to learn more about the book and what to read the book, because castles are kind of those fantastical things that we all want to have and we all want to imagine when we think about a fantasy book. But I also have this as kind of their interior of what a good castle would look like. And this article in particular was talking about what the average castle would look like. You have the Great Hall, you have the chapel, you have the curtain wall, you have the kitchen, you have the keep, you have the stables for the horses, you have the turrets, you have the gatehouse, and yeah. And the Great Hall was obviously where the throne room would be and where royalty was, but where also higher ranking soldiers might have eaten. So you kind of hear about that. So I decided I was going to kind of read some from articles, and then I was going to jump back to my idea and what I might do further. I haven't been able to really work on the idea as much as I liked, as I kind of mentioned before, due to their schools starting back up and wanting to make sure I get good on test, because the teachers decided to do the test all at the same time. Okay. So I'm going to start reading from this article from the Foundation for Economic Education. In attempting to understand the ideas and institutions of the period of history that is usually called the Middle Ages, it must be kept in mind that this covers a time frame that is easily divided up into smaller periods. Each can be with its own unique characteristics and qualities. Furthermore, each part of Europe had its own historical development in terms of traditions and customs. Only one institution encompassed the entire European world through most of its time, the Catholic Church. So that was a big point that in my last stream I kind of learned about. I knew already about the Catholic Church's influence in some degree, but I didn't really know how big the influence was. And I was going to read an article on that a little bit later, but we'll get to that later. And John's here, and hi, John. The Middle Ages is usually defined as the beginning with the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's where I'm starting my book, was after the fall of the Roman Empire, as I did think it was an interesting time period to step into. And I guess I'll talk about that a little bit more, because I put a lot more thought into why I wanted to place my book in early Middle Ages instead of later. This was a time of chaos and a time where influence wasn't just in one area and wasn't just in one empire, with being the Romans. When the Romans got defeated, although many people saw it coming, due to the Romans' actions beforehand, it was still a huge part of history when they got defeated. And I thought it was just a time that I could influence in my writing and a time that I could use. And what I mean by that is I could take advantage of what the chaos would have been like with empires. And although the empires I'm having in this war never actually existed in this time period, it would be interesting to kind of clash the ideas of what they had with the ideas of the medieval times and with the ideas of the fall, because it's a good time period where influence all of a sudden became something different than just one place. And in this article, I took a large part of what their research was with their name calling and systems, as you can see here. I kind of copied and pasted, and I'm going to put this in my own words and then a little bit later, but I kind of just been reading articles and copying and pasting chunks of what they say and what I find important from it, and then later I come back and kind of add my own words. And I'm cited every article, not just for the fact that if I end up using information in my book, it needs to be there, but also the fact that I can come back to these sources if I need to. And I'll just kind of read from my page I have here, because I kind of already combed through the article, and instead of just trying to find the stuff, I'll just read what I've already put. This in stark contrast to life in the Middle Ages. It has been estimated that between 80 to 90% of Europe's population lived on the land and devoted all their time to the production of food. The remaining 10 to 20% of the population was either following various small and relatively small trades and crafts in towns, provided personal service to the nobility, or were members of the Catholic Church and therefore ministering to the religious needs of the people. The manor, or the residence of the Lord, who both owned all land and ruled over it, used and the people on it through possessing a high degree of power and legitimacy. Each manor unanimously served as mostly self-sufficient economic entity in which all production for the local members was performed. Besides growing their own food, the manors raised livestock, milled their own grain for bread, spun thread to make their own clothing, and produced and maintained most of their own farm and manufacturing implements. The manors contained within themselves three characteristics that were unified politically and economic activities in one institution. They instinctively used labor for the performance of many tasks and duties, and they were extremely self-sufficient. So I found that last part interesting, with being extremely self-efficient. Whew. When you tend to think of the poor, and this is kind of a bias I think a lot of people have, and if not a lot of people have, it's a bias that I think I've become aware of recently, or maybe not recently is the right word, but I've thought about a little bit more. And that is the fact that when you normally think of the poor, you don't really think of them as being self-sufficient and being smart within what they're doing. Like when you think of a homeless person, you don't really think that they're very smart because they're without work and living on the side of the street. And that's a very harsh way of looking at things. But you can take that example into medieval times with higher up society looking down upon the poor, and most importantly in the medieval times with manors and with property owners using their peasants or serfs as labor, even though their labor was actually really important in doing so. And the article also talked about how a lot of manors and lords gave a lot of freedom to their serfs or to their peasants within growing their land and within working their land, because they knew what they were doing. So I kind of take that into modern days when you think of like crops. A lot of crop people who end up going through the fields and picking, avocados or picking tomatoes aren't necessarily people who are highly educated. But if you were to put someone who is extremely highly educated into that role, they wouldn't do it as well, because for one, they don't have the knowledge like the other peasants in poor society have. And it's a harsh way some could say it looking at things, but it's really the reality of what it was, and it was the reality for the medieval times as well, because the serfs knew a lot about, and the peasants knew a lot about how to take care of tasks and duties within their land and within other components of working with their property owners, so to speak. So obviously I put this whole bunch of chunk of research and other peasant life that I mainly read in my last stream, and you can go to my last stream if you're interested in kind of hearing about those articles. But I thought I would kind of go back to my idea, and then I'm going to skip to the Catholic Church's influence, because I'm debating where I kind of want to start my chapter. I haven't really written as much as I would like, or as much as I would want to do, but it's all a process, and writing does take a long time, and especially with what I'm doing. But for today, I kind of wanted to think out loud and think about how I wanted to progress this chapter so that next week I'll actually have some writing. I wanted to get writing done for this stream, but like I kind of said, I wasn't really able to. But if I really get my ideas down and my direction down today and in this live stream, because I've kind of been thinking about these ideas throughout the week, I'll probably be able to get the writing done, and the writing will be well done for this next stream, and what I can kind of fully point to you in what direction I'm going. And also, hi Jimmy. So, kind of what I brainstormed from my last stream and where I plan to go from ending of my last chapter. And you have to remember, in this first idea, it was using what I had written originally for my horror project as the prologue and starting the chapter by itself. So I kind of have the running title for the chapter being 375 AD, The Darkness Continues, and that is when the fall of the Roman Empire roughly happened. So I briefly wrote a couple sentences just to kind of get my mind going before the last stream, and I'll read those sentences again just in case if you weren't there, as it says, the summer sunrise hits the northeast castle wall, casting an ominous shadow even the greatest enemy would be afraid of. The poor and the wise were the only ones awake, although they lived very different lives. The city within the castle walls never knew the time of day. And I haven't ended that paragraph or that dot in full yet, even though that could technically be a sentence first. And I kind of mentioned this on the last stream, but it's still an ongoing idea. I don't think any writer is able to write one sentence or one paragraph and not go back and change what they've written before and add more detail. And that's kind of how my writing is and how I've always been as a writer, especially since I haven't been extremely well practiced in writing. But that's just how it is. So it's going to take a while, and each stream is going to be a little different than the next. And I hope as I grow in writing more, the process becomes faster, as again, more practice means you get better at it. Well, that's at least how it's supposed to happen. So I kind of brainstormed some ideas and the timeline of how I thought the chapter would go on from now. And I have these ideas as what I plan to do. I describe the poor compared to the rich, mention Catherine's name but not shown, introduce Sir William and Sir Jester, had a Queen Guard show demanding, Sir Jester talks with soldiers for next defense plan, have Catherine walking through the dungeons. So as I was going to write the chapter, I had described the poor. And again, that's where I started on my research and really wanted to understand how the poor peasant people actually lived. And I thought about it a little bit more, and I kind of wanted to maybe switch gears a little bit on how I wanted to start the chapter. In my prologue, I explained the scene of what was happening very well. I described it as rainy, and I had the person rusting off his gear because it was wet and it was muddy, and it just seemed ugly environment. It didn't seem like something you would just want to walk out in and have a bike ride or anything similar to it. So I thought maybe I want to start my chapter 1 the same way. And not that I want to start every chapter with describing the scenery, because Although it may be a smart idea to kind of ground the plot and to ground the reader into what's happening within the scene, it will become repetitive and become boring. But I think as a chapter 1 idea, it would be interesting. Because if I go with idea 2, which is continuing the chapter, I won't have to really describe what the castle is like with the unknown empire. Because if you listen to my previous 2 streams, you'll know that this empire I'm talking about and this empire I am writing about in chapter 1 has yet to have a name. But the main character is from the fall of the Roman Empire, depending on how you look at it. With idea 1, the main character is in the prologue, because I haven't really mentioned the first male main character, and it will be the first female main character, with being Catherine being mentioned. But I don't really want to have Catherine talk or to have Catherine really involved in the story fully until the end of chapter 1. Although that may seem a little odd, I want her name to be mentioned by name and not her be first mentioned in her actions or in her own words. I kind of want her to be a mysterious type of character. But as I was saying, I was thinking, well, do I really want to describe the poor first off the bat? Because what I was originally thinking was talking about the poor lives in detail and about how the poor lived, mentioning several different factors in life, like maybe the poor person was waking up and having to take care of the crops, or maybe they were getting degraded by some person who thought they were higher than them because they owned property, or something within that, and really describing how the poor lives, or mentioning the typical environment a peasant person or serf person lived in, with being mud houses and just not the perfect type of environment that you tend to think about when you think of medieval and fantasy, with being not dungeons, but being big rooms with comfortable beds and all this other stuff you tend to think about when you think of fantasy in general. But as I was thinking about that, I was like, I don't know if that's the best place to start with describing the poor. So I thought maybe I want to mention the scenery and talk about the castle. So I was debating between 2 ideas. My first idea within this chapter 1 is either I go ahead and describe the poor in that vivid detail and kind of maybe even have a minor character be a poor person to kind of ground the chapter in that poor person's perspective. Because I do plan to include a lot of like POVs and perspectives of one or a group of characters, and not just have random characters all throughout, or to have a omniscient narrator, so to speak. That's not something I really want to do in my novel. So I had one of just go ahead and describe the poor and do like how you have it outlined already. But my second idea was describe the empire. So if I describe the empire, that takes all the mystery out of who the empire actually is. So I was thinking, is that really the best way to go? Do I want to keep this empire kind of mischievous or kind of not really understood? And as I was thinking about that, I'm like, well, you don't have to fully describe the empire. You can mention like what it looks like, but not necessarily talk about other things that really reveal the empire fully. So you can still describe something and not make it fully known. And that's maybe what I want to do with the empire as well, at least for chapter 1. But I was thinking, do I want to fully show the castle? And that was kind of another thought I had going on. And I thought, well, again, I don't really have to describe the entire castle. I can describe certain parts of the castle where the main characters are. So I thought that's how I was going to kind of get around really fully showing the empire and mentioning the empire even by name, even though I might decide to do so. But I do think describing the poor and then going to the rich is a good way to kind of ground the empire into, one, how the average person lives, and two, how we tend to think of medieval people as living, and really so you can kind of see the difference. So those of you who are in the chat or watching later, I'll be interested to see kind of what you think of those ideas and kind of starting the chapter. Do you think I should just go ahead and describe the poor and have a poor person's viewpoint and kind of continue like how I was originally thinking? Or do you think I should kind of describe the empire and where we are, and then go on to describe the poor, and then to describe the rich? So it would add kind of one more bullet point or one more paragraph, maybe even 2 paragraphs to the story, but I do think it might ground the reader more into what they're actually reading about. But I'm not particularly sure exactly which way I'm going to go with yet. So those are kind of the main 2 ideas for the beginning of my chapter. And then I was going to mention Catherine by name, but not shown. And this was kind of because I want to keep Catherine as a mischievous, not well-known character. And if you listen to any of my previous 2 streams, you would have known that by now. But I was trying to think, how do I want to do that? And I thought the best way I could do that for my writing talent and for how I am thinking-wise, at least right now, is by mentioning Catherine by name, but not fully showing her in a scene. And what I mean by that is talking about Catherine in a way that makes her seem untrustable, or maybe not even untrustable, but talking about her in a way where this person feels like they know her. They know everything about Catherine. She's predictable. She's not smart. She's ugly. Whatever verbs or adjectives you can come up with. But in reality, she's none of those things, and she's actually outsmarted this person the entire time. But that plot line won't happen till later on in the book. And you kind of have to plan what you end up doing with your chapters and with your book from before chapter 1 to all the way, so that your story becomes a thing you can follow plot by plot, and it becomes something the reader would want to turn the page to. So that's why I've also kind of struggled to fully write and what my plan is, because I kind of want to make sure I at least have a future a little bit to continue on. But I don't want to keep downgrading what I think, or keep focusing on too much on the future and not writing the now, because it is important to continue writing the process and not just think about the future and only the future for what the book might be, because you need to get there first. Anyway. Then it says, introduce Sir William and Sir Jester, and I had head of Queen Guard showing demanding. And again, I kind of talked about this on my live stream last week, or last Monday, about who Sir William and Sir Jester are, with Sir William being kind of the head of the Queen's Guard, and Sir Jester being kind of like the head of defense. So I don't really want to talk about that too much, but I'm going to go back to it and kind of add bullet points on this stream and kind of add ideas. But my last part was what I wanted to get a lot of thinking on, and what I've thought about a lot throughout the week. And that was have Catherine walking through the dungeon. So, as I mentioned, Catherine is a very unknown type of character. And I want to keep her kind of that unknown type of way. And I was trying to think, how do I want to ground that in the way where you don't necessarily trust her right off the bat? And I thought, why not have her walk through a dungeon? And I was trying to think, why would someone walk through a dungeon? And that brought me to my idea of having who could be her henchmen. And I kind of talked about that, but I was thinking, I don't really want it to be just soldiers, or like in the case of Game of Thrones where they used prostitutes as their kind of henchmen, or you had Varys using young children without tongues so that they couldn't speak against them as his spies. I was trying to think, what do I want her spies to be? And I was trying to thinking, why not have her spies as criminals? People that kind of know the underlands of what the plot actually is. And I mentioned in my prologue, Avacus Henry. And Avacus Henry, real quick, is somebody who ends up joining the army because they want to get rid of their sentence through joining the army. So essentially, they would join the army, and then after a certain amount of time, they would be able to be released. But an advocate was someone who, although they got released, would end up joining back into the army due to whatever reason it might be. But it was someone that became intertwined with the army, and someone that had a little bit of respect despite being a former criminal. But I was thinking maybe I could have had Advocate Henry as someone who was one of Catherine's spies, kind of going throughout the story. When you learn more about Catherine, and maybe when I go back in time or talk about him through another character, you learn that, wait a second, Advocate Henry was fulfilling her plan, and that's why they ended up getting attacked. Although he died for the cause, he died because Catherine made him do it. And why did Catherine make him do it? So I was kind of thinking maybe I could kind of go back and kind of link everything together through Advocate Henry and through Catherine, because I do think that a good book goes back and kind of links characters together. So that's kind of where I've been and what I've thought about all week. So I was thinking, where do I want to go from now, and what do I kind of want to talk about on this live stream? Because I haven't really been able to put a lot of things down on paper or to write a lot of things down on Word documents and other things. It's a lot of been thinking in my head and thinking about what I want future characters to be or future characters to represent and other things like that. So I thought, why not I flesh out the idea a little bit more and maybe add a few more bullet points so that I can kind of define what my idea is going to be about. So this is where I was trying to think. So depending on which idea I go with being either going straight to describing the poor or going to describing the castle and the environment, I was trying to think which one would make more sense. And I asked you earlier in the chat which ones y'all thought would make more sense, or would, if you were a reader, would be more interested in hearing about. But as I was thinking throughout the week, and I kind of mentioned a little bit ago, was just like, well, I feel like I could maybe do a little bit of both. And describing the scene, but keeping it still a little mystery, but still being able to go on and then describe the poor to compare to the rich. And I was thinking, well, how am I going to do that? And I feel like I've kind of repeated myself a little bit, but this has kind of been my thoughts. And I've been asking myself questions very similar to each other like this all week. And although the questions may sound like each other, and as someone who's trying to write this book, each question I ask is a little bit different and gets a little bit of a different answer. So I was thinking, well, how do I describe the empire and describe the environment? If I do both, how do I still keep it grounded and not reveal too much? And that's where I started to think, why don't I describe maybe the Catholic Church's input? So I was thinking, well, I could have this empire be the Catholic Church. But that would change the dynamic and how I go about writing this chapter. Because if I end up going with this empire being the Catholic Church, that changes what I can end up doing with them. Because the Catholic Church had a huge impact in the medieval times. And so if I end up saying this unknown empire is the Catholic Church and maybe changing a few things about it, it would change kind of the perspective and what originally I was thinking with empire. And to kind of show that I was going to talk about this article also by the Foundation for Economic Education. The Catholic Church is complex, fascinating role in the medieval society, it is titled. The Catholic Church was an institution that was outside of the feudal law of both the royal manors and the town guilds, the church at various times may have formed alliances, made political compromises, and sanctioned and conducted in laws that were contrary to the spirit and the letter of the church doctrine, but those were argued to be expediences of the short run to preserve the independence and moral authority of God's institution on earth, so that it might serve the long-run purpose for its existence, the salvation before the final day of judgment. Early purpose of the church. There was only the fact that the Catholic Church and its leaders often held their own earthly ambitions for wealth, power, and political control, even declaring and participating in the wars of conquest with the church's own armies under the command of the Pope. In this book, Naturalism and Culture, Rudolf Reichbar explained the use of church power during the papal reign of Innocent III. Innocent forced the whole temporal power of Europe under his will. He not only interfered in all dynastic affairs, he even arranged the marriages to temporal rulers and compelled them to obtain divorce in case the union did not suit him. Innocent thought of himself as Pope and Caesar in one person, and saw in the temporal rulers only vessels of his power, tributary to him. By the establishment of oral confessions and the organization of mendicant monks, Innocent created for himself a power of tremendous scope. Furthermore, he made free use of his strongest weapon, the ban of the church, which, with unifying resolution, he imposed upon whole countries in order to make the temporal rulers submissive to him. And the land hit by ban of all churches remained closed. No bells called the faithful to prayer. Those were neither baptisms nor weddings. No confessions were received. No dying were given extreme euthanasia, and no dead buried in sanctified ground. No one can imagine the terrible effects of such a status on the spirit of men at a time when faith was regarded as supreme. So that was kind of a interesting point I thought about with writing my book, because I knew that I was going to have to involve religion somewhere within my novel and somewhere within my idea. So I thought, how was I going to implement religion? And obviously the first thing that came to my mind was using Catholic and Catholicism and the church as one of the religions in my book, and its impact and the impact on the everyday lives it would have had. And religion hold a very, very, most importantly, Christian religion hold a very, very important role in the average medieval serf and medieval peasant's life. The the church position made it unique in another way as well. The church domain was neither a single country nor region. Its offices and representatives were located in every part of Europe's continent in which Christianity had triumphant. The church representatives all shared a common value system, Christian church doctrine. They all spoke through the common language of Latin for the sharing of religions, philosophy, and administrative discourse. The church outlook, in other words, was international or cosmopolitan. So that was an interesting thing that I knew about, but didn't really think about the impact of it too much. The Catholic Church used to just be in Latin, and popes and deacons used to be the only ones that really understood Latin, and people would go to Mass and go to church and not really know exactly what was being said. And that's a rather interesting thing, because the reason a lot of people theorize why the Catholic Church did that and why they might have done it as a whole, and that could be a debate, would be interesting to hear in the comments on what y'all guys think, was the reason that the Catholic Church did that was to control what was being said and what was being fed to their citizens, or to the serfs and to the peasants of the time, and to the people or persons of the time. Because through controlling information and through controlling what people are supposed to think about, they're able to control a mass amount of people and kind of treat them like sheep, so to speak. The significance of the church's authority in temporal affairs can be appreciated in terms of the famous edit of 1041, the Truce of God. These wars between nobilities and the kings and princes had become so fierce and disruptive of social and economic life that the church declared Thursday through Sunday as days of devotion and prayer, during which the fighting of battles and the shedding of blood were declared to be sins against the church. As a consequence, war diminished or created for a period of time through large parts of Europe the cost of maintaining, paying, feeding, and housing sizable armies of mercenaries who could fight only 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, was often too great a financial burden for the lords, noblemen, and princes in whose service those professional soldiers were employed. So the article goes on a little bit more, but I thought it would kind of stop there, as it kind of talked about the church's impact in a way that I thought was very solid and described it in a very good way, because obviously I knew about the church's impact, I knew about the church's role. So that brought me to an idea. Well, if I want to include religion in my book, should I include it this early? And if I should include it this early, should it be done in chapter 1 within this unknown empire? Because as I've said, I have yet to give it a name. So I haven't quite decided if I want to do that yet. But I'm thinking that I'm not going to do that. As I kind of want to save the church's impact and the church's role for a little bit later in the novel. So that kind of brings me to ground one, into kind of where I started this idea as a stream. As I've thought about it in my head, and it's really kind of hard to say until I kind of put it on paper more, and hopefully I'll have more for next week after all these tests are turned in and after school kind of calms down a little bit, as professors kind of learn the online a little bit better, and as I learn online a little bit better. But I was trying to think, where do I want to start this novel? So hopefully by next week, you'll learn which idea I end up going with either describing the poor or describing the city or doing a little bit of both. As I do think a little bit of both is what I'm leaning for right now, but I'm not completely sure what I'm going to do. Hope you enjoyed the stream. Although I didn't get too much progress done from last week, I still hope you found some of the information important. And feel free to comment in the section below what idea you liked better or what ideas you might have for the book or for what I forgot, or even more ideas about the Catholic Church's influence, as I do know a lot of people know about it and a lot of people find the Church's role very important. And I hope that you'll stay tuned for my next stream, which is going to be on Monday. I had to do it Wednesday because this week was a little bit crazy, but I plan to keep these consistently on Monday from now on unless something happens. And I hope to have finished at least a couple paragraphs and have this idea a little more fleshed out by then. But see you till next time, and hope you enjoyed.